Chapter 5, The Lechering Diary, of Professor John Mcbean, The Continuing Adventures. Contents, Preface page 3, Cien's Contribution page 3, Introduction page 4, Flight TG 955. Oslo, Bangkok. December 20th, 2019 page 4, Narrative Function page 5, The narrator George introduces himself page 5, Advice to the reader page 8, Jekyll and Hyde, John's Double Life page 8, Puritan West and Sexually Free East page 8, Public versus Private page 8, Chapter 5 Sign page 9, Direct quote from Professor John's Diary page 9, January 6, 2020, City Garden Grand Hotel page 9, George Comments page 9, Return to Sign page 12, Flash Forward, March 16, 2020 page 13, Regarding Scams page 15, Ploy and Her Daughter Fern in Thailand page 16, Retrospect Comment about Ploy, as of July 17, 2022, page 16, Salaried Girls page 17, Return to Diary, Sign, City Garden Grand Hotel page 17, Description of Sign page 18, Sign Reports, page 21, Brief description of Sign page 23. Preface, The Wandering Diary of John Mcbean as reported by his amanuensis, George Donald Mac Blair, The Fortunes and Misfortunes of the Non-Famous John Mcbean, who was born in Culcheth, Lancashire, and during a life of continued variety for 60 years and more, was 12-year an abuser of ex-workers, a flagellator, sadist, 5 times a husband, a thief throughout his life, several times convicted, under aliases, at last grew rich, lived honest but unrepentant. Cien's contribution, N.B. John and George are not the only authors here. Cien added dialogue for the various chapters.
Introduction, Flight TG 955. Oslo, Bangkok. December 20, 2019, sitting in seat 39S of the Thai Airways flight from Oslo to Bangkok, John was drinking copious amounts of free cognac and red wine. He was trying to alleviate his feeling of knackeredness, after months spent working and clearing out his apartment in Grünerløkka, with the vague idea of renting it out, in order to restore his faltering finances. This was the first time he had left Oslo since August 2019, so he felt he deserved a new vacation. As noted above, this is the Diary of John Mcbean as reported by his amanuensis, George Donald Mac Blair. John always traveled with his diary, as he believed one should have something sensational to read on the plane or train. He took out his diary and read it and made some notes. John and George were good friends. George rarely criticized John to his face, although he felt morally superior to him. In other words, George was John's rational self, John was Sherlock Holmes, while George was his sober friend, Dr. Watson. Thus, John would drink copious amounts of red wine and intake other enhancing drugs, not laudanum and coke, the favored narcotic substances of Holmes, while George, like Watson, would remind John that this was not good for his health in the long run, and that it might distort his view of the world, to which John would reply, reality is an illusion that occurs due to the lack of drugs in the bloodstream. John appreciated their friendship and said on more than one occasion, "You are such a trusty comrade, and a chronicler of my life." John was what you might say a reprobate, so he appreciated having a sober and rational friend like George. In other words, as mentioned, John was like Sherlock Holmes. Holmes was a genius and addicted to drugs. He was a genius, and addicted to good red wine, and other medicaments. Of course, the reader might suspect that there was some kind of homosexual attraction between John and George. There will always be a gay subtext of such buddy stories, as is evident in the so-called buddy movies. But let's face it, men learn to love themselves before they love women, so in one sense all men are homosexuals. But, we will not investigate this theme further here, but just highlight the peculiar relationship between John and George. Narrative function, the narrator George introduces himself, "I am the narrator. My name is George Donald Mac Blair. I am a friend of John's." John is also a narrator on some occasions, but I am the main narrator. However, before we progress further I should perhaps add some comments as an introduction. In fact, this travelogue is just a continuation of several others. I work as a writer, translator and teacher, amongst other things. So I focus very much on language, detail and correctness. But I'm writing this for free, so I have jettisoned correctness. This is a true story, but some of the names are changed so as to avoid lawsuits. In fact, I have even got the name of the main character mixed up. So, in previous diaries, the main character was called Professor John McLeod. Here the name has been changed to Professor John Mcbean. This isn't really a mix-up. Our hero's family comes from the Western Isles of Scotland, so the different names are just names from the family tree. But I don't want to lose the plot here, so enough said on this subject. This was really a digression to introduce you to what I really wanted to talk about, myself. I am the amanuensis. Or rather, I am the narrator, George Donald MacBlyer. I'm not really a character in this story, but a mere amanuensis, in the same way Carl Johnson wrote the story of King Sverre of Norway, one of the so-called King sagas. But I differ from Carl Johnson in that I do not intend to glorify the main character of the story. In other words, I am no mere bondsman of John, but a free citizen. Of course, I should perhaps mention here that although John has instructed me to write this epistle, he does this not because he wants to ex-workers himself to the be-goddess of success, or because of money, as he is already sustainable, so to speak. It's more a kind of rambling of the mind. You might compare it to Dark was the night, cold was the ground, which was launched into outer space on the Voyager in 1977. In other words, a totally pointless endeavor. For those interested in literary theory, I will provide the third-person point of view, while John sometimes provides the so-called first-person point of view. But to avoid the tedium of pointing out first-person in contrast to third-person, this will be structured to some extent as a dialogue between myself and John. Apropos, both John and I are simple, prosaic and practical characters. Alan Sillitoe, one of the angry young men of post-war British fiction, was advised by Robert Graves to write about what you know. Well, both John and I intend to follow this advice. The fact is we know little of the world apart from ourselves, and we don't know ourselves that well either. To cut to the chase, we don't intend to make the mistake of many other authors and imagine we have insights into the workings of the female mind. Which authors are guilty of this crime? Of the recent books I have read, I can mention D.H. Lawrence and Jack Reynolds. Of course, Reynolds in A Woman of Bangkok, 1956, makes a brave attempt to describe Vali's inner life, but doesn't succeed. Lawrence in Lady Chatterley's Lover, 1928, makes a partly successful attempt to describe Connie's inner life. John suspects that Connie might in fact be Lawrence. Both John and I are very assertive characters, so we won't admit that Lawrence is superior to us in writing gobbledygook. We put it down to the fact that Lawrence is a feminine-like person, and is thus skilled at describing the histrionics of so-called feminine inner life. To conclude, neither John nor I intend to investigate the inner life of the girls and women that John encountered, at least, no more than superficially. Advice to the reader, and now friend reader, you must prepare your heart and your mind for the most boring and inane tale that has ever been told. Jekyll and Hyde, John's double life, Puritan West and actually free East. Of course, it is highly ironic that the West today prides itself on being free. That is, actually free. Despite the fact that the West has become liberated in many ways, it still bears traces of Victorian culture. In other words, it is still puritanical in a sense. Public versus private, the West is still associated today with the Victorian concern over the public and private division, the individual sense of playing a part. That is, the fundamental dichotomy of the 19th century, outward respectability and inward last, as this period had a tendency for social hypocrisy. This has been described in detail in many novels and documentary accounts, such as Stevenson's Jekyll and Hyde, 1886, The Flower Girls of 1851, and George Bernard Shaw's Pygmalion, 1913. Chapter 5, Sign, direct quote from Professor John's diary. I have 2 free days before I meet Sign. I was too lazy to book a new hotel, so I just extended the stay here at City Garden Grand Hotel in Manila. I have been upgraded to deluxe, much better and bigger, and on the right side of the hotel with a city view facing the traffic-congested Makati Avenue. January 6, 2020, City Garden Grand Hotel. George comments, as indicated, John was still in the same hotel as he was too lazy to move, and from his perspective he had managed to get a reasonable price. Professor John changed hotels a lot on previous trips, every 4th to 5th day, because he didn't want to get caught red-handed by his girlfriends and students, or have to endure the knowing looks of male hotel staff. But now he had become more indifferent. He had spent 3 days and nights with CNE, although she pointed out that he had said they would spend 4 days together, so as to maximize the educational session. John had known Sign for a number of years. He met her for the first time in 2014 at Breton Cafe in Greenbelt, Makati, Manila. She seemed shy and despondent at that time. She was slim and pretty. She spoke good English, and seemed to be quite smart. On meeting her again in the same Breton Cafe, in 2021/2022, John asked her, "How are you, darling?" Yes. I'm good," Sign replied shyly, as if the world's problems were on her shoulders. John met her several times a year, 2 or 3 times a year, at least before the COVID pandemic. Although she was pretty and slim when he first met her, she was not the ex-bomb or Lolita type. In fact, she was just a plain but pretty single mother. Over the years her backdoor had grown in diameter somewhat, so she was changed from a prim young girl to a more substantial, mature woman by the time she reached 30. But John liked her because she was always accommodating, sympathetic, affectionate and easy to talk to. So despite the fact his actual interest in her had waned, he still kept contact. John was not so enthused about being intimate to Sign, but she was very willing, and eating the treasure usually got Long John to stir from his Rip Van Winkle slumber, if eating the fleshy pearl didn't do the trick. Then John grabbed her hand, so she could try to resuscitate expired patient, by manual means. If this manual resuscitation failed, then he demanded she give Long John the kiss of life.